Here's a question for you. If on January 1st you received 1 penny, and that penny were to double in value every day, meaning on January 2nd you had 2 pennies, on January 3rd you had 4 pennies, and so on, how long until you had $1 billion? 10 years? 6 years? 6 months? We will come back to the answer shortly. Now consider something more recent and much more familiar. In 2020, the COVID virus shut down our way of life. According to the World Health Organization, the first confirmed case was on December 1st, 2019, in Wuhan, China. 1 month later, there were 41 confirmed cases. By January 20th, there were 241. The virus was doubling roughly every 2.5 days. Within about 60 days, it had entered an exponential growth curve, but it was still largely invisible to most of the world. By March, there were 80,000 confirmed cases. 1 month later, there were 1 million. By May, 5 million. By June, 10 million. By November of 2020, 40 million. Exactly 12 months later, over 100 million confirmed cases. When something grows exponentially, it rarely feels exponential while you are living inside it. It feels incremental, manageable, maybe even overhyped. Then, almost without warning, it is everywhere. This is where things become deceptive. As humans, we are wired to think in linear terms. We measure progress step by step. We expect change to unfold in a steady climb, but exponential systems do not behave that way. They bend and then they accelerate. They compress time in ways that are difficult to intuit. The most dangerous phase of that curve is not disruption. It is the period before it, when the underlying change is real, but still easy to dismiss. It is the moment when leaders believe they are observing gradual progress, while the system itself is already accelerating beyond their assumptions. Back to the question. If you receive a penny that doubles every day, you become a billionaire before February. In exactly 31 days, you cross $1 billion. That is the nature of exponential growth. In We Are As Gods, Peter Diamandis and Stephen Kotler use both the penny example and the spread of COVID, drawing on data from the World Health Organization to illustrate how exponential systems behave. They highlight how something can move from nearly invisible to overwhelming in a very short period of time, not because it suddenly accelerates, but because it has been accelerating all along. They describe this dynamic through what they call the 6 Ds of exponential technologies. At a high level, something becomes digitized. It enters a deceptive phase where progress appears slow and easy to dismiss, and then it moves into disruption, where the underlying curve begins to collide with existing markets, cost structures, and organizational assumptions. The later stages describe how technologies become cheaper, more accessible, and more widely distributed. But the critical inflection point for leaders sits in that transition from deception to disruption. That is where most organizations misread what is happening. It is not that they are unaware of the technology, it is that they misinterpret the timing. What looks like incremental progress is often the early stage of a curve that is already bending, and by the time it becomes obvious, the impact is no longer gradual, it is structural. That is where many organizations are with AI today. But before we go any further, let me take a minute to introduce myself if you are new here. My name is Chris Schmelzer, and I serve leaders who recognize the need and understand that the old models of leading and working are no longer keeping up with the pace of change. Every week, I track the subtle signals that a massive reset is coming for what we refer to as white-collar work, and share thoughts on how to lead yourself and your organization through the age of accelerating change. If you find any value in this video, like it, share your comments below, and subscribe. Recently, OpenAI shared that ChatGPT has reached massive global adoption with hundreds of millions of active users and approaching nearly 1 billion users at scale. It is worth pausing on that for a moment. ChatGPT was released in early 2022. In just a few short years, it has gone from a novel interface to one of the most widely used consumer applications in the world. The number itself is significant, but what matters more is what it represents. This is not just adoption at scale, it is adoption at speed. Behaviors are shifting globally in a compressed window of time that most organizations are not designed to recognize, let alone respond to. By the time many organizations are still debating policies, individuals have already adopted these tools in their personal lives. They are experimenting, learning, and reshaping how they think. From the outside, it does not look like much has changed, but underneath, expectations are already moving. This is what makes the moment deceptive. In other words, leaders believe they are evaluating a technology, while the technology is already reshaping the behavior of their workforce. Adoption is not waiting for enterprise readiness. It is happening in parallel and often ahead of it. This is what deception looks like in practice. It does not announce itself as disruption. It shows up as small improvements. A task gets faster, a workflow becomes easier, a team saves a few hours. But as those gains compound, the economics begin to shift. Fewer handoffs are required. Teams get smaller. Decision cycles accelerate. New competitors emerge that are built on entirely different assumptions about how work should be done. What looks like incremental improvement quietly becomes structural compression. This is why the narrative around AI feels fragmented. Attention is pulled toward fear and debate, while the underlying behavioral and economic shifts continue to accelerate. The more focus moves toward what might happen, the easier it becomes to miss what is already changing. And that is where the risk begins to take shape. The question is not simply whether AI will take a job. The more important question is whether it will change what a viable organization looks like before leadership teams fully register what is happening. In a linear world, organizations scale by adding people, layers, and coordination. In an exponential environment, those assumptions begin to break. This is why examples like Medvi are worth paying attention to. The surface level story is that it is a two-person company disrupting telehealth. The deeper signal is what it suggests about how organizations can be structured. Medvi was founded in 2025 and generated roughly $400 million in revenue in its first year. In 2026, it is projecting close to $1.8 billion in revenue. Pause on that for a moment. A company that is effectively a small coordinating core, leveraging AI and external networks, scaling from hundreds of millions to nearly $2 billion in revenue in a matter of months. They compete with Hims and Hers, a company with thousands of employees and a far more traditional organizational structure. The implication is not simply that AI replaces individual tasks. It is that AI collapses the cost of coordination, creation, and decision support. When that happens, the question shifts from how many people are needed to do the work to how few people are required to design and manage the system that produces the work. Even more telling is the reaction. As Medvi's growth has accelerated, regulators such as the U.S. Food and Drug Administration have raised concerns about aspects of its marketing practices, including the potential use of AI-generated customer reviews. The growth appears so far outside expected patterns that it invites skepticism, and that skepticism is part of the signal. When something grows this quickly, and in a way that does not fit our existing mental models, the default response is often to assume something must be wrong, rather than to question whether the underlying assumptions about how organizations scale are beginning to break. This is the nature of deception. It is not that the change is hidden. It is that it does not feel urgent until it suddenly is. By the time the shift becomes obvious, the underlying conditions have already changed. And that is where the real risk sits today. Not in whether AI will improve productivity, but in whether leaders recognize how quickly it is beginning to reshape the structure of work, the design of organizations, and the expectations of the people inside them. We are in the phase of deception, and in certain areas, you can already see disruption beginning to surface. This moment matters. Most leaders are still approaching AI through the lens of adoption. How do we get our people to use it? How do we implement systems to automate work? How do we ensure we have the right policies in place? Important questions, without a doubt, but they may already be lagging the reality of what we have entered. A more important question is beginning to emerge. How do I manage my organization through this disruption? Within that question, adoption, implementation, and governance still matter, but they follow. The risk right now is that many leaders are focused on integrating AI into their existing systems, while assuming those systems themselves are stable. They are assuming that the infrastructure they have built is resilient to what is coming next. That may not be the case. Peter Diamandis describes exponential progress as a chain reaction that always leads to upheaval and opportunity. What is important is how that statement ends: upheaval and opportunity. Those two forces rise together, but many organizations are operating as if the upheaval will be limited and the opportunity will take time to realize, as if their scale, their history, or their structure provides insulation from what is unfolding. In reality, the exposure to both may be far more equal than it appears, which brings us back to deception. This is a moment where it is easy to mistake the speed, pace, and velocity of change for something more gradual. When we do that, we underestimate the risk we are exposed to, and at the same time, we underestimate the upside that sits in front of us. So how do you navigate a moment like this? How do you lead yourself and others through it? An important and often overlooked part of the answer sits beneath the strategy. As humans, we are prediction machines. Our brains are wired to anticipate what comes next. That capability has allowed us to survive. The better we can predict, the safer we feel. The brain is rewarded for certainty. But in a moment like this, where the pace of change is accelerating beyond familiar patterns, that system begins to break down. The brain struggles to form reliable predictions, and when it cannot predict, it defaults to protection. It interprets uncertainty as risk. It narrows focus. It amplifies threat. This is why, in a moment of exponential change, the default human response is not curiosity or exploration. It is hesitation, resistance, and fear. And this is the inertia you feel, both within yourself and across your organization. Leaders do not miss moments like this because they lack intelligence or access to information. They miss them because they are operating inside systems, both biological and organizational, that were designed for a more stable, more predictable world. Exponential change does not feel exponential while you are inside of it. It feels ambiguous. It feels complicated. It feels uneven. It feels easy to dismiss until it doesn't. And by the time it becomes obvious, the underlying conditions have already shifted. So how do you begin to see it for what it is? Part of the answer is not strategic. It is physiological. If you want to navigate a moment like this effectively, you have to learn how to regulate your nervous system. Because the moment your system shifts into threat, your field of vision narrows. Your thinking becomes more rigid. You default to what has worked in the past. In other words, you become less capable of seeing change clearly at the exact moment when clarity matters most. This is why deception works. It is not just that the external environment is changing quickly. It is that our internal systems are wired to misread that change. When the pace accelerates beyond what we can predict, the brain does not become more curious. It becomes more protective. It scans for risk. It looks for stability. It tries to hold on to existing models. And that is where leaders get stuck. Not because they lack information, but because their system is not in a state that allows them to interpret it accurately. There is a simple way to begin shifting that state. Before your next meeting, before making a decision, or when you feel that sense of urgency or pressure, take 90 seconds and focus on your breath. Inhale for a count of 4. Hold for a count of 4. Exhale for a count of 4. Hold for a count of 4. Repeat that cycle for 90 seconds. What this does is bring your prefrontal cortex back online, the part of your brain responsible for curiosity, pattern recognition, and more expansive thinking. The exact capabilities required to navigate new technology, challenge assumptions, and see what others might miss. It is a small intervention, but it creates space. And in a moment like this, space is what allows you to respond rather than react. Because this is the difference that is starting to emerge, not between those who have access to AI and those who do not, but between those who can stay regulated enough to see what is actually happening and those who get pulled into fear, urgency, and reaction. We are in the phase of deception. And what comes next is disruption. If you want to explore how to lead yourself and your organization through the age of accelerating change, my new book, The Missing Link, offers a new lens. It shows why most change efforts stall and how human capacity, not just strategy, determine success. Once you see it, you'll lead change very differently. You can access it for free right now. Link is below the video.